You guys ready?
Right.
Sure.
All right. Hello, thank you all for coming. My name is Francesca Salter. I am on the board of talkPOPc, which stands for Philosophers Ontological Party Club, if you guys were not aware. And I will be the moderator for this discussion. Let me quickly introduce Sean Tatol, the founder and art critic at the Manhattan Art Review, and then Dena Shottenkirk, founder of talkPOPc. This event is a book launch for Dena's new book, Art is Cognition, How Gist Reframes Aesthetic as Conversation. Before we begin, I just wanted to give a little overview of talkPOPc. The project is multimodal, topic-based, and engages the public in philosophical thought by inviting participants to explore the role of conversation in both art and philosophy. And through doing so, discover what they themselves think about a particular topic. At talkPOPc, we reject the idea that art and philosophy are kinds of soliloquy, just from one person out into the world. We really do think of both of them as inherently forms of conversation between the creator or the writer and the viewer or the reader or listener. Dena Shottenkirk activates these conversations through the three main pillars of talkPOPc. Those include published philosophy, such as her book, visual art, which is in the next room over, and podcast conversations, which we will be recording in the tent after this. So exhibition events such as these incorporate all three of the pillars of talkPOPc. For this exhibition, same with her book, the focus is on our third topic, which we call Art as Cognition. So maybe to begin, I can ask Dena to give a brief overview of the book.
Hi. Again, thanks, people, for coming. It's very kind of you. This book was sort of my way of trying to figure out how it is that we assess art and how it is that we look at art. And so I kind of went back and looked at some basic science behind perception, and that may seem sort of contrary to a lot of, art people are looking at art, but, we're using our eyeballs, right, when we look at art. And so I think it's sort of fundamentally important to sort of figure out how eyeballs work. And there's been a lot of really interesting research in the last 30, 40 years on what's called gist perception. And it's the first 300 milliseconds of perception. So you see just a tremendous amount in the first 300 milliseconds. Part of it is subconscious, right? But it motivates us to then edit out and look further in certain areas. Gist perception happens in a different part of the brain than object recognition. So you see the whole scene, right, instantly. You can tell indoor, outdoor within 100 milliseconds. You can do that. Importantly, to me, you can tell things like orderly and disorderly within 50 milliseconds. So you look at a scene and you know if it's safe or not safe. So something like, J.J. Gibson, if you know his work, the psychologist who was in the 60s, Canadian psychologist, he talked about affordances. And when we look at something, we see what that thing affords for us. So it establishes a kind of emotional relationship with the thing. So our emotional relationship that we have with things happens just instantaneously. So I think that, when we look at art, we're not looking for objects and we're not looking for those specific things. We get the whole scene immediately. And the consequence of that is that it sets up then saliency decisions, like what's salient to us, right? So when you look at something, you get this whole scene image, and then you look further on the basis of what's salient to you. So saliency maps, saliency maps are really important in vision. So we see contrast automatically, but we also see what we care about. So when you look at something in your gist perception and you see something that you care about, you will then attend to that afterwards. So we see what we obviously already recognize. So gist then frames it as a conversation to me, right? So I see something instantly and I get some very basic sense of it, but that basic sense of it is what the artist has given to me. So right now I'm in a conversation with the artist. The artist is already communicating a point of view to me, and part of gist perception is me grasping that. It's also a conversation because we share that point of view with other people next to us. When you stand and look at an artwork, you're also communicating to the people next to you about what it is that they see. And then that then reinterprets your saliency maps and makes you look for things that you hadn't seen before. So the meaning of that artwork is sort of slowly accrued. But the initial point of that perceptual process is the gist. Just physiologically, the initial process is the gist. But the rest of those processes involve conversation, the conversation between you and the artist, the conversation between you and other viewers. And so the accrued meaning happens quite slowly in that way. And so I think it's very much a kind of philosophical conversation that is art. So art is not looking at what's beautiful. That's a completely wrong point of view that's been perpetuated for a very long time in philosophy, and it's completely wrong. That's not what's going on at all. We develop, as members of the seeing group, right, we develop the meaning in art. So art is a very important way that we socially communicate with one another, that we learn the sort of inner workings of each other's minds. So it's a really important way of communication and of conversation that we have with each other. It's not discerning some instantiation of this ideal beauty. It's not that at all. It's a way that we understand one another and can work with one another. So I think art is a very fundamental human activity for that reason. That's the reason that you see it in humans and you don't see it in other species, right? It's our way of organizing. It's the fundamental way that we organize with each other and understand each other. So it's a very cognitive process in that way. So, yeah, that was way too long. I apologize. Ask a philosopher and go to sleep, right? You know.
So you talked a lot about people's point of view and their interpretation, and how that brings such an importance to the meaning of the artwork and how it is a conversation. So through this interpretation, we do often bring a form of judgment when we are looking at a piece of art. What role do you think judgment plays in looking at art? Sean, what would you say about that?
I mean, so I think you already frame it pretty well in a way that I approach the position, which is, you already said that it's not about beauty. And I think the way to frame it is that we're both against the Kantian model of aesthetics, and that the sort of basis of the Kantian understanding of that there's an objective notion of beauty that's sort of that art deals in, that there's a sort of categorical norm, what he refers to as the sensus communis, the sort of common sense of art. That's sort of the idea that if you see something and you recognize it as beautiful, then you then want everyone to agree with you that it is also beautiful. And
so fascistic.
Yeah, well, it's treating it as a sort of flat concept that is, to me, the polar opposite of what it actually is, which is that it's a constantly mediated sort of back and forth, conversation between all these different forces of, different people's perceptions, the world around us, the development of technology and culture over time, that these norms of, of fashions or styles or whatever, that these things are constantly changing and being redeveloped and mediated across like different categories that do not conform to any sort of like normative model. So the thing to me about judgment regarding art is that it's what people, I think, bristle at as a sort of like, oh well, how could you say that this is bad when I think it's good? Or is that art is not purely a individual subjective experience. It is a field. Art is a discipline with a history and an arc that, which is not to say that, the critic is, the voice of reason that, states things from on high. It's that there's a sort of, some people are more equipped to attuning themselves to understanding art within its own context versus art that you're attracted to for your own personal point of view. That to me, I think is a major difference. I think is that you take broadly speaking, I think an artist's own relationship to their taste in art, oftentimes, if not always, relates back to their own personal tastes that are related to what they do. That you sort of are attracted to an artist an artist is attracted to another artist because they see something in that artist that they can use for their own thinking about their own art.
Stealing.
Yeah, stealing, borrowing, or just
Yeah.
sort of seeing a sort of self-identification with something that is of interest to them in their own process of making art. Whereas a critical perception is, I think, should at least aspire to be more general than that. If not, I don't believe in it being objective, but I do think it's sort of it's a sort of broader, more even
Less
banal
biased,
standard.
yeah,
less biased. But
I think it's less biased,
I
yeah.
guess this is there's a Wittgenstein quote where he's talking about genius and taste, and he says that genius has no need for taste, and that taste, he's kind of being self-deprecating. He's like, I don't have genius, I have taste, and that I think that is broadly the same distinction, where sort of an artist who has a sort of deep investment in their own practice finds that deep depth in other artists that relates back to their own sort of engagement. Whereas a critic who has a sort of broader understanding of taste, or what good painting consists of broadly, in like without necessarily determining anything about it, it's more like just a sort of a sense of familiarity with the arts in general, and that you can put down in words what you recognize as something that not defines, but something that characterizes a good artwork. Sort of like, I recognize this in an artwork, and therefore I think it's good, and that a critic has a sort of ability for. This was, after looping around a bit, I remembered a good idea or thought I had was that that it's a sort of thing of like, if I think to myself about why I'm an art critic, or why I think I'm someone who's suited to the job of writing about art, being an art critic, it's not that I think I have a emotionally deep connect. I don't think I'm profoundly sensitive to art. I don't have like Stendhal syndrome or something. I don't think I'm particularly good at being like a close reader of artworks. I never like stare at a painting for an hour or 2 hours or whatever, which a lot of people like to brag about. But it's more that I find that I have a knack for assimilating information and assimilating different sort of categories and terms for art from different contexts and synthesizing them into kind of an understanding of art in general.
Can I ask you a question? Do you feel like that you've got two categories? I'm seeing a Venn diagram in my head, right? Do you think that you've got two categories of work that I like and work that is good, and that sometimes they overlap, but sometimes they don't overlap? I mean, have you ever seen work that you go, I know it's good, but I don't particularly like it?
Yeah.
Or work that you go, I like it, but I know it's not particularly good?
No, I think that's actually that's a great example of, I think, that sort of I think the distinction with artists, or what Wittgenstein called genius, is that the two are conflated, where it's sort of there's no sort of interest in this is good, but I'm not interested in it, because they don't bother with caring whether something's good or not, because they're an artist. Their job is to be involved in their own art. They don't really care about whether something's. It's not necessarily a concern of theirs, but.
But do you feel that as a critic? Sometimes that you
Yeah,
look at something,
I try to as much as I can.
Sometimes
I find myself, I try to be self-conscious of that, and to be try to be impartial. But there's a sort of self-consciousness in the act of judging, I think, and I think that's maybe it. Is that it's a sort of it's that there's the experience of an artwork, and that's a thing that people are familiar with, and it's, and then that's the sort of Kantian thing, where it's just sort of, you can talk about beauty in the way that you talk about looking at some mountains and relating that to looking at a beautiful painting, and that's a certain type of experience. But the critical or judging relationship is actually sort of more based in a familiarity with the experience of being in front of artworks and knowing what that experience is like and self-critically observing that experience and discerning if it's exceptional or unexceptional based on your experience of it.
Now, Sean, let me ask you another question. So in my book, I talk a lot about low-level features, right? And so low-level features are those things, particularly that you experience in GIS, that are like color, illumination, texture, super important to our perceptual processes, contrast, black and white, all these kinds, which is very distinct from object recognition, right, or from scenes, the depiction of scenes. So when you're talking about having sort of this broad experience, right, of looking at art, how much do you think, for you as a critic, how much do you think that experience relies on those kinds of low-level features? That might be an odd question.
I mean, this is sort of what I was already thinking when we started, is that it's a sort of, we're almost at like the opposite poles sort of, like in the center of it is looking at art, and that's pretty simple in our minds, but you're starting from like the most basic building blocks of scientific understanding of how that physically works, whereas I'm sort of trying to synthesize the entirety of the experience
Historically.
Yeah. And that those.
I think that's true. I think that's a good description.
So that's my way of.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to duck the question. I just don't really know how to approach it.
Yeah. No, I'm just curious, right?
So, well, I had a quote it was something I read yesterday. It was Jean Genet on one of Rembrandt's last self-portraits. Okay. And the quote is, Rembrandt's last self-portrait seems rather to be saying this: I shall be so intelligent that even the wild animals will recognize my goodness. The morality that guides the artist, then, is not the vain quest for a proper apparel for the soul. It is the métier itself, insisting on goodness, or rather bringing goodness in its wake. And that to me is a really, I kind of, it caught my attention because I think it was a very compact issue to me that is the sort of grounds of what artistic value or quality is to me something that I ultimately ground in the relationship between the artist to their own work. That the artist's métier, the process, is something that, he said it doesn't create goodness, and it's not that goodness is sort of like, following a moral law. It's that there is something created in the wake of the process of making a painting that Rembrandt accomplished that we can partake of or recognize, and that is a sort of goodness.
That's what we're looking for, right?
Yeah.
And can I jump really?
Please do. Please do.
Somebody said to me, Magda, my old flower dealer, that the most important thing about art is whether or not it's truthful. And I think of art epistemically, like I think it's a kind of epistemology, the way that we get knowledge of the world. But I think you emphasize, and I think you're probably right about this, you emphasize the kind of, good that one gets from the work, right?
Yep.
And if that is based in sort of telling the truth, so if the artist is telling the story the most honest way they can possibly tell the story, right? This is my phenomenological experience of the world, right?
Yep.
And if the artist is really true to that and then conveys that to other people and does it well, then the person, the viewer, can look at Rembrandt or whatever and go, this is Rembrandt's point of view. Right?
Yep.
I get this point of view. Like, this is pretty astounding, right? But the artist has to tell it, not just succinctly, but honestly, right? And that in that telling, I think you're saying, tell me if I'm wrong, that there's a kind of goodness in that.
Well, I wouldn't go to that in my own words.
Yeah.
I think just because it's only just because it's a messy
it's a
word.
little,
like
I know,
he says it,
very
and
platonic.
I agree.
It's very platonic in some ways.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. Is that it's not
Yeah.
I think of it more in an Aristotelian, teleological sense.
Well, that's true also. That's true also.
Yeah.
Look, so for Aristotle, right, the
Yeah.
telos, your
Yeah.
goal, right, you know, that's what you set with desire.
Yeah.
And then you figure out the way to get there. But what makes it good or bad, right?
Yeah.
You know, for Aristotle, what makes your telos good or bad? You know, he's never, you know, he does this whole thing about the mean and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But at one point, you know, he does it in the ethics. He says, but there's this one quality, and it's what makes the bad man bad. And we don't really have a word for it.
Yeah.
but he knew that there was like this other end of the story that's like, no, those are just bad. That's just bad, right?
Well, so this is, I told you about that, the Alistair McIntyre After Virtue book, because then that's a very Aristotelian book, but it's sort of, it's an interesting sort of archaeology of the way the sort of ideas of the moral were sort of presumed in, you know, Plato and Aristotle's time as a sort of like the cultural values of the city-state are synonymous with one's personal values, and then through the Enlightenment, you know, there's the attempt to rationalize these values, and that sort of scientific rationalization of it is what he's against. And what's I think, and the problem with the book is that he kind of critiques a lot of things, and then there's like maybe 4 pages where he really actually says what he thinks. Yeah. But I liked it because I think I'm on the same page as him. But basically what I think it is the you can retain this notion of teleology of just the idea of development, of that, you know, that the good in that sense is, are you a good butcher or a good gardener or whatever, and that's there's a sort of notion of a progress within the category, and that I think the, you know, sort of all the sort of like, you know, godless Spinozist postmodernist notions that I hold to are that I think you can have a teleology without a telos at the end of it, that you don't need this goal,
A defined,
there's a sort of self-reflective observation of the subject that you can constantly refine and try to develop without predicating an endpoint or presuming to know where it could go.
maybe what that would be, right, would be that the objection that you might have to the telos would be that it would be an articulated verbal description of where you're going, whereas if you're, right, so let me just jump back a second. So, you know, when Aristotle talks about what makes a good horse, right, a horse that runs fast, what makes a good knife, a knife that cuts well. So what makes a good artist, right? I think, right, in your telling, what makes a good artist would be somebody who has a well-bonded, came to mind, a well-bonded relationship with their process and what they're trying to say in that process, a kind of commitment to their process, a commitment to what they're saying, right? Which you wouldn't want to articulate, right? Or you would destroy it, right? But if you have, and I think that was why I said honest, right? If you have a degree of honesty about what it is that you're going toward, even if it's not a well-defined telos, if you kind of go, yes, this is the right step. Yes, this is the right step. This is the way I'm going. This is an articulation of my phenomenological experience in the world. That if you do that consistently over years, then that's what makes a good artist.
Right. And that's perfect, because I also had an example of another thing I read yesterday in a different book. Was about, it was a blanking on the name. It was someone who used to be the director at MoMA. But it was a study on Cézanne's influence on Cubism, and particularly Cézanne on Braque, emphasizing Braque over Picasso, which I know you'll like.
I will like.
Picasso.
I will
but
like.
there was just a sort of little aside where, because even though Cézanne, you know, idolized the Venetians and the Renaissance and said he had no use for the primitives, Braque revered Cézanne, but also sort of was kind of annoyed with the idea of like Veronese making like painting a beautiful cup or something. He thought that this level of like technique and finish and sort of basic talent, facility with paint. He was kind of annoyed with it and found it trivial, and he preferred
I didn't know that.
Giotto and Uccello and Cézanne, and Cézanne and Braque, neither of them are what you would call gifted painters in a purely technical sense.
True.
And that Cézanne, if push comes to shove, may be my favorite painter of all time. So the sort of the question then becomes, well, okay, if he's not good at painting, what is he good at?
But he is good at painting.
I know. But the sort of that it's not. It's this sort of. It goes back to this Rembrandt thing of sort of there's a where this what Genet was saying about Rembrandt, that there's a sort of like goodness that comes in the wake of the creation of the work. That with Cézanne, it's that's what's so sort of towering about him is the sort of struggle inherent in the mediation between being an artist making marks and you looking at the world and wanting to translate or to recombine those things is the struggle itself is more intrinsic than supposed accuracy or
the end product,
facility in how well you can make an elegant brush mark or something.
Yeah, the translation part is important.
Yeah.
And the what was the word? Not recombine, but bring it into your own perspective. Yeah, but both of those are important, right? Like you look at something like Cézanne and you get the world that Cézanne is talking about, right? And it's a very articulated world that Cézanne has worked out. And in that process, you understand not only Cézanne's mind, but you become a sort of different reconstituted, that was the word, right? A reconstituted person, because now you're the person who understands Cézanne. Which is a very different person than you were before you understood Cézanne.
And
right?
Something that I think ties in very neatly with this is the book I was reading was a book on his late paintings, and that these sort of paintings in the last decade of his life, like his after the age of 60, are really the crowning achievement where he really arrived at what he had been struggling with for his entire life, and that there was a sort of struggle for, it was really 40 years of bashing his head against the wall that brought him to these things where he achieves something that he himself wasn't very, satisfied with, but the achievement of it is a extremely crucial sort of crux in the development of modernity in painting, that there's a sort of abstracting away from literal representation that then is picked up by Braque.
Right. Can we sort of jump into deep waters and talk a little bit about modernism and then postmodernism?
Okay, yeah.
All right, so you emphasize history and the reading of history. Do you want to talk a little bit about why you do?
Yeah, so I think I had something in my notes on. So I think the thing about history, because I've thought about this, and I think, or I've talked about this, and then people have sort of pushed back against it, and sort of, I don't know, just a sort of like, there's that was the funny thing when I did the talk in Vienna over the summer. I was sort of talking about need for rigor in art history and blah, blah, blah. And she's like, I'm Russian, and they did all rigor, and I hated that stuff. And I'm like, well, I'm from California. I didn't have any rigor. Of course I love the idea of rigor and, strict rules. So, that there's a sort of, dialectic between sort of the unrestrained freedom and the structured, rigorous, rule-abiding system. And that, like we were saying earlier, that the sort of you have one and you wish you had the other, and then you get to the other and you wish you had the other one. So it's just a sort of, you always have to be mediating these things. But I think, so in thinking about the sort of blanket statement of like, oh, history is important and people should be concerned with these things, what I've come around to as a sort of maybe hopefully easier explanation of it is just in the simplest terms, what I think is important about an engagement with history is really just like, if I think back to my own sort of development of my interest in the arts, it's that I was sort of always digging through the past instead of passively receiving all the new things that came out, and sort of sifting through these old things and trying to understand them and trying to make sense of them, just watching old movies instead of being excited for the new movie coming out or whatever. And I think, you know, just the passive reception of media is something that, you know, you can say that the arts aren't doing very well now, but that in the last 20 plus years, the media machine has gotten far better at sort of keeping you docile and amused in an increasingly empty way.
Yeah.
And so there's just that going back and grappling with the history of whatever medium, just in the arts as a general field, makes you understand more about it. Like, you know, it's just like if you've only ever listened to Taylor Swift, you think that's what music is, but if you like force yourself to listen to Beethoven, and you know, you're like, oh, this classical music's so annoying, but then like if you stick with it for a while, then you sort of start to get the size of it in a way, in you know, in the sense of looking at a Rembrandt, that there's a sort of depth in that art in the present maybe pales in comparison to, and just.
And why do you think that is?
Well, it's a. Well, so this is the thing, is that I think there's an incredible amount of development implicated in Beethoven or Bach or Rembrandt, you know, whatever, any big name. You know, I don't want to get like canonical about it, but just that any great artist that is remembered, there's a reception of history. There's a sort of lineage. There's a tradition or a culture that, you know, someone in Bach's time, if they were going to become Kapellmeister or whatever and write cantatas, you went through a certain system and you were participating in that system, and that system was living.
And codified.
Yeah. And that you had to, you know, and that's not to idealize it, that because, you know, Bach had his own struggle, you know, whatever, 12 kids too, you know, it wasn't easy, but you know, there's a participation in a structure, and that I think the contradiction, or not the contradiction, but the impasse of the present is that modernity has consisted of a sort of constant breaking down of these traditions and modes, which is not to say that they shouldn't have been broken down. It's just that I think, so this is the thing that I think is the main fundamental point that I disagree fundamentally with sort of the ideas of postmodernism in general, is the idea of like deconstructing, breaking down the frameworks of society. There's a sort of presumption that at the end of the work of breaking it down, we'll automatically arrive at truth or a more justly structured society, and that the sort of that the breaking down is a loss and a gain, and that the building up of something else is a extremely difficult process that we perhaps can't predict, like how these things happen. You know, that they're sort of accumulated across time. Just, you know,
Yeah, unintended
just
consequences.
the like folk songs, you
Enormous.
know,
Yeah.
are things that just happened organically over hundreds of years. And, you know, those structures, no one crafted them. You know, it's whatever,
Yeah.
Homer, blah, blah, blah. And
So
so,
if
yeah.
you think, Sean, sort of, you know, you're of course right. You know, the whole process of modernism was this patricidal overthrowing of the most recent style,
Yeah.
right? And all right, so recount it super fast, right? You have that 100 years or so of modernism, and then you get to the 60s, and then sort of postmodernism is born partly as an influence of French deconstruction theory. True, absolutely, right? That, and so then you get this like, all right, we can do neos and we can redo things and we can mix and match the styles, and
Yeah.
that's what postmodernism is. And everybody's been complaining for decades, you know, that we're stuck in this quagmire,
Right.
And everybody keeps looking for the next style.
Right.
My point of view, I don't know if you agree, my point of view is there's not going to be a next style, that that's over. That what we're doing now is something quite different. And I think, again, I don't know if you agree, but I think we're probably transferring our attention into something more like what you were talking about earlier, about sort of valuing the point of view of individual artists and focusing on that more, sort of separated from the demands of any kind of style. Because it seems to me that kind of all over the world, everybody has at their fingertips the whole stylistic innovations. Everybody knows Cubism, everybody knows Impressionism, everybody knows how to do it like this, or do it like that, or do it like this, right? And that what is going on now is that you have sort of individual artists figuring out a very particular point of view, and then kind of on their own articulating that outside of approved of style.
Yeah.
But maybe you disagree.
I think I disagree.
Okay, good, go.
Yeah. So I
Go.
think
It's great. Yeah.
I think the paradox at the center of it is that the individual break from stylistic norms is itself the norm.
Yeah.
And how do you break with that? It's sort of like a finger trap. It's a sort of logical impasse. And the problem, and I think this is where history comes in, is that you have to get your roots from somewhere. You can't reinvent the wheel.
Okay, I do agree with you. Yeah.
And it's just a sort of, my worry is sort of just the basis from which an individual artist's sensibility that distinguishes them, how that comes about in, you know, the fallow ground of postmodernism. And that I don't have a like prescriptive answer for it. I just sort of, I think there's a structural blocks that kind of hem people off from thinking seriously about what they're doing, artists, I mean, what they're doing in a broader sense. You know, just sort of like the like commercialization of art would be kind of like the trite example of sort of like, people are like, well, you know, these types of figurative paintings are selling, so I'm going to do that sort of figurative painting. And you just sort of think about that, and you just think about your own career, and the sort of like, whatever's going on with something like Rembrandt is like a million years off from where you're thinking. And so the sort of the problem of the real sort of struggle of what Cézanne spent, you know, 50 years trying to do, you know, trying to paint one apple, like that struggle is just societally not, you know, encouraged or even condoned.
But that seems to be a separate point, right? The point that you're making, which is totally legitimate, is that there are so many awful market forces right now that constrain artists' ability to develop their own voices.
Yeah.
That's the point, right? But that point seems separate from the other more difficult kind of historical point, which is how do we get out of this quagmire of postmodernism? I mean, that may be an additional block about how we get out of the quagmire
Well, I
of
think
postmodernism, right?
I think they're kind of intertwined in the sense that artistic achievement only occurs within the context of the culture
That we're in.
that it's in. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, so
Yeah, it's true.
here's a good sort of the one point from, because I watched your talk with Nicholas last week, and the one point where I was kind of like, I don't know about that, was where you were talking about art school, and you say like, okay, well, so all the students, they're all in front of a model, and they're all drawing the same model, and they're all going to draw it differently. It's like, of course, there's going to be granular differences in everyone's sort of handling of the subject. The problem is, if everyone's 16 and doing it, like, it's all going to be pretty banal. Like, they're all going to be bad in very small, differentiated ways, but they're all going to be bad. And that the sort of notion of like basic talent in one's ability, which could be, I think there's like a thing of, like, this is purely anecdotal, just kind of pulling it out of my ass, but just like you go to art schools today, and it's the kids who have the most sort of technical facility are the kids who grew up drawing like anime, and they can only do cartoons, and they can do just cartoons in this one way, and they do really well. Yeah. But it's like only within this really tightly delineated, like, kind of stifling box.
That's mimetic. That's very mimetic.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is that these sort of I don't know. These sort of subcategories of terms that sort of block people off are sort of.
I taught drawing at the prison a couple of times, right? At the Metropolitan Detention Center, which is a federal prison. And they were women prisoners, and a lot of the women prisoners had never drawn ever.
Yep.
And they were all so distinct and so different because
they
had
of course
never,
they'll all be different.
they'd never, so they're, I don't know,
I just think in the terms of art historical importance, etc., that it becomes a sort of struggle. Like, I think it's a sort of there is a sort of grappling with the weight of history and the sort of problem of facing up to one's forebears, and the sort of sense of lack in comparison to the people who influenced you, that you like, whatever, like, I'm never going to be Shakespeare or something. That's intrinsic, and that actually the awareness of Shakespeare, if you're a playwright, I guess, that these achievements of the past are things that you do have to grapple with and do have to have a knowledge with if you want to be a artist that is going to be, in the history books, which is like, the thing is, I don't think it's even necessarily a thing about like wanting to be so great. It's that the sort of achievement that leads to something important needs to be it has to be like something that occurs on the substrate of the artistic culture that the person is working within. So a good example of something that I also read about recently was just this thing about, when Jackson Pollock was first shown in MoMA in the 40s, the general public was like, what the hell are you talking about? There's a dead bee and some dirt that got on this canvas. You call that art? And I thought that was a brilliant little aside, because in retrospect, the sort of like, oh, okay, he dripped the paint. 70 years on, you're like, okay, whatever, dripping, I get it. It's not that fancy, it's not that impressive. But the fact that he got a bee and some dirt in it, I think somehow encapsulates how far out and sort of radical and unrestrained he had to be doing that in the 40s, when to do something that rude, which was so sort of like shocking to the general public, that that he was really struggling, and that struggle led to the drips, led to the paintings that people still talk about, and also led to the bee.
So there was a logic, you're saying, there was a logic in the process that he had done, and that logic led logically
Yep.
to the bee and the dirt and all of that. And it's that process that then is basically sort of encircled and thought about when you think about what he had accomplished.
Yeah.
Is that right? So, all right. So that kind of goes back. All right. So now you've got Pollock doing this sort of individual trajectory that then becomes meaningful to other people, right?
Yep.
But that individual trajectory that becomes meaningful to other people was, though, connected to the historical accomplishments of the past in some way or other, right?
Yep.
And particularly stylistically, right?
Well, yeah, I think the thing is that with him, it's like it's a connection, but it's also
A rebellion.
Rebellion, yeah.
That's right.
Integral to
That's
it,
right.
yeah.
Right. But that's kind of part and parcel of modernism, right? With that rebellion
Right,
is built.
it's very
Rebellion is built into
classically
it.
that.
Okay. So now we don't have that.
Right.
This is my point that I'm trying to drive
Right,
home.
right.
Now we don't have that real possibility of rebellion anymore. Right. It's like punching oatmeal. Like, what are you going to rebel against?
Right.
Yeah. So now we have a very different historical problem, which is how do we make something meaningful in a situation where almost everything gets eaten immediately and is diminished in meaning?
Right.
Okay, so, all right, let me go back and ask the question again, right?
Yeah.
Because you disagreed before, so we should nail down what the disagreement is, right? I think there's no real possibilities of like finding a new style in that kind of modernist way.
No, I agree in the specifics of the sort of notion of the avant-garde modernist innovator
Is gone.
I think that is a
it's
washed
dead.
out category.
Okay,
definitely.
we agree. All right, great. We agree on that.
It's more the prescription of
How we go forward.
of how we go forward.
Okay.
Is which
Okay.
is, if anything, my only complaint is I don't really pretend to know specifically like what.
I bet
art
that's
should
not
do.
true. I bet you do. And some, I think if we throw enough fishing lines in there, we can get it out.
What was it?
Well, all right. So let me pull it back, right? Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is the answer, but going back to sort of perception and the social connections, I think that consensus building is something that is a really fundamental part of art making.
Right.
I mentioned to you that I'm going to Ghana to give a talk in a couple of weeks, and the other philosopher there does work on consensus, right? So I've been thinking a lot about consensus, and I think that style, right, I think had this shorthand version of developing consensus for us. Like when we could look at a particular style, whether it was expressionism or something like that, I always get this picture of like hand luggage, like you have expressionism, so you have a piece of luggage and it has all the symbols that you need in order to interpret that artwork. Yeah. So you have wild emotions, you have intensity, you have all of these things. So the meaning that you can get just is sort of packaged for you already.
Right.
We don't really have that now.
Right.
We don't have that. So, we're not able to sort of like grab onto a style and go, oh, yeah. It's like keyboard shortcuts. We can't do that. So I think that what we have to do, which I think is what you actually do as a critic, is spend time kind of investigating that system of meaning that a particular artist has developed. And so instead of having that piece of luggage where it's all a shorthand for you, you have to sort of spend the time going, well, this person is trying to say this and they're trying to say that. And if I look at it over years, I kind of get a different sort of development. But ultimately, I get a story is the wrong word. It's not a story in a narrative way.
It's a character.
A character maybe is better, right? I think a point of view, right? But that you get a point of view, but it's just an individual's point of view.
Yeah.
It's not a group's point of view.
Well, I think this is where we disagree.
Okay, so tell
Because
me.
what my contention is,
Yeah,
is that a developed, thoroughly individual point of view doesn't arise in a vacuum.
Well, no,
it
that's
only
true.
happens
that is
culturally
true.
and through a sort of social framework. And I think that's
You
sort
might
of
win on this
the basis for sort of like
Yeah.
the problem that turns around in my head is that I think, if you take the sort of whatever rise of the postmodern sort of relative impasse, is that that's been going on for 50-ish years, but it's only really become a problem, like a glaring sort of obvious problem in like the New York art world in the last 15 years or so. And I think what kind of perpetuated it in the intertwined or intervening 30 years was the persistence of local social scenes.
That's true, actually. That's
And
true.
that-
People
and
were
that the-
excited about postmodernism at one point in time.
Yeah, and I think that
It's true.
the
Yeah.
internet is, it's trite to say, but I think did sort of dematerialize those sort of frames.
It took the air out of it.
Took the air out. Yeah, people
the air out
don't
of
get excited.
Like,
in
I don't
those
want to hear this
And I think that
anymore.
people
Yeah.
sort of that's sort of
Yeah.
like the basis is this assumption that
Yeah.
that novelty and exciting artists were just going to sort of pop out of the ground without any sort of fertilizer in the soil.
Yeah.
And that now that it's sort of run out, people are kind of confused.
But you think that this fertilizer in the soil is also history.
Well, it's I think because I think that culture bleeds into history. The two things interconnect, and that what the sort of the good span of postmodernism was sort of like, okay, we don't need that history stuff. We're free from it. We can throw
I
it in
get
the
it.
trash. We can keep moving, and that it petered out. It wasn't a sort of a new foundation of a new world where you can kind of throw, the sort of,
I do see that point.
and this is sort of the binary that I've been sort of trying to
I do see
think
that.
through is that, you take someone like high modernist, like, Clement Greenberg's position, where he's like sort of like formalist, like no, like vision and taste are objective, and that there's a trajectory to history and color field is right and minimalism is wrong. Obviously he was overstepping his bounds there, but he was such a dick that the postmodernists were all like, no, judgment and taste, that's all bourgeois, that's all, just baggage. So we got to throw that all out, and we're just going to do theory about art now. And that I think both sides are wrong in ways that you can sort of reconstitute a sort of an understanding of even the break from taste, because history recombines these things. Like, I think the easy example is sort of like this idea of like, Dadaism is like, oh, well, we're tired of painting and, art schools and taste, so we're going to do the crazy weird stuff that has no aesthetics. We're anti-aesthetics, and we're not going to do any of that stuff anymore. But I think the work is purely aesthetic, and it's aesthetically recognizable immediately to us because the work's over 100 years old, and you can categorize it like with your suitcase, and you pull out the luggage, and you're like, oh, well, it's the Dada style.
We know, yeah.
So that that's the paradox of avant-gardism, or why it kind of ran aground, I think, is that the sort of idea of breaking from the norm was something, and this is something I said to you in an email a while ago. It's just that the avant-garde artist thinks they're breaking away from history, and that they think they're off in their new category, but then time passes and it just gets eaten up by history, and it's part of the continuity that they thought they broke from.
Yeah.
But
And there's no real way to break.
the enthusiasm they felt and being like, I got out.
Yeah.
I don't have to think about all that stuff anymore, is why the work holds up. Mm. But the self-delusion is the idea that history has been left behind and we're in a brave new world of don't have to think about painting anymore.
I hate to interrupt. We're coming up on time. I don't know if you want to say some final thoughts before we finish.
I wanted to say one final thought,
Yeah.
and then maybe we could open it up to questions.
Sure.
Yes. About theory, the problem with theory.
Mm.
It seems to me that the problem with making art according to theory is it's the same kind of like problem with beauty. You know, that you've got this a priori standard that then you're having to measure up to. And so that's a very different, that kind of deductive system is a very different kind of system than the inductive system that you're talking about with judgment and taste. So the inductive system with something like judgment and taste is that we sort of gradually accrue and understand this pattern. We're not matching from the standard and mimicking that standard. So I think theory is a really bad approach.
I mean, you know, it has its place, but I think that's, I had a note that I think was to the same point, which I guess I'll just read. Is, art is moral in the sense that morality, the exercise of the faculties of judgment, are only in play when they are not defined by rote learned rules and ideology, but grasped and navigated by the sense one has of the world to the best of one's abilities.
That's very nice.
And that is thinking as opposed to
That's
authoritarian behavior.
Yeah. Did you write that?
Yeah.
That's very good. I like that a
Well,
lot.
I wrote it because I was taking notes for this. So.
Yeah, that's very good.
Pat yourself on the back.
I think it's very good.
Should we open up for questions?
Yeah.
now? Okay.
Is that
Would anyone like to ask a question? Any thoughts? Please.
Yes. Hi. My name's Noah. I know I was late. It was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
So I guess I think it was very helpful how you were maybe enunciating what an artist should do particularly, or how they should have a particular practice, perhaps, as opposed to being part of the style or a movement. And I guess maybe the ways that it was being framed, what's the difference between an artist doing those things, as you're putting about to be in a scholar in a different way, that is coming from a scholar or a writer or an academic, being in a particular milieu, analyzing their corner of the world, knowing that history has happened, but not being too concerned with it, but also not being too concerned with making something new. It seems like, I guess, if that makes sense, that the way you were phrasing how an artist should operate today feels scholarly. Does that make sense? And if not, can you help me enunciate?
Is that for me or for Sean or for both of us?
My thought about it is that I think the ultimately, like, art is differentiated from other things. Like, I think an interesting thing about art is that how hard art has attempted to get out of the space of judgment, in the way that, I don't know, there's like a Richard Wollheim book where he says, like, as an offhand observation, that visual art is the only art form that doesn't rely on critics to sort of establish the conditions of it. You know,
See, I don't like him.
Oh, I haven't read the book.
Oh, I don't like Richard.
But it was just interesting to me the just the offhand observation that criticism is sort of relied upon for music and literature in a way that art has tried to be like, oh, well, we don't need any of that. That's oppressive or something. And I think the thing is that the sort of conditions of judgment that undergird most things are just particularly amorphous with art. Like, so I think, you know, there are academics who are, you know, exciting to read or have, you know, big ideas, and then there's ones who are sort of dry and droning, but they may have their own virtues. And that I think it's just sort of, it's a more of a rigidly delineated field, whereas art is defined by sort of its lack of delineation, where, like, you know, I think, like, I often think of, like, like wine tasting or something as a sort of analogy to judging art.
Hume says so, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's exactly
Yeah.
what Hume says, and that
Yeah.
the only real difference is that like making alcohol is a industry that is more normal than art. Whereas that with art, the thing is that the industry of art is particularly now very disassociated from serious judgment, or whatever that would be.
I would answer it a little bit differently. There's this distinction philosophy makes between first-person and third-person analysis. I don't know if you know. So the first-person analysis is what the world feels like to me, right? So Thomas Nagel's famous, right? The feel of life, right? So I think that what artists are doing is taking a first-person experience and making it accessible in a third-person way. So it's this bizarre thing that we do, right? Where we take, this is the way the world feels to me, and you make it visible to somebody else. What scholars do, on the other hand, is really trying to assess things in a completely third-person way. So I'm going to tell you what the world looks like, and we're all going to agree on it, right? Because we all have the same third-person perspective. So but I think that's the great mystery of art, is that we go from this like sensorial, this is the way the world feels, and it becomes a physical manifestation of that. It's bizarre, right? Yeah.
That's a better answer.
Yeah.
I like yours.
Any other questions or comments? Please.
This is maybe a good feedback to that question. I'm just curious, Sean, I read your review of the Asawa
Oh, yeah.
of it, and I feel like there's a little bit of overlap, and because I know you had a criticism of her that I think aligns well with what we've been talking about, which is like, are you working towards a point of view that's specific? Just curious of like the artists that are on view now. You can even limit it to just like museums because there's just more maybe like length to their work. Like who impresses you? That's for both of you. Or if you have any points of view on that, like who you think is good by that metric who's on view?
Yeah, well, it's. I mean, off the top of my head, I mean, it's kind of conservative because it's older art, but the Man Ray show is very interesting, and actually the Calder show at the Whitney is the one where it's like a circus, and it's unusually fun for quote unquote modernist art. But there's a sort of, it's almost, yeah, I think it's interesting because it's so, it's like for children, but it's like a great modernist artwork anyways, because it's like there's a sort of precious toy-like craftsmanship involved in these, mechanisms that are just, they're far less austere than his mobiles. And so I think that's maybe a good example because it's not, I think that work is fascinating because it doesn't adhere to sort of the normative understanding of modernism from a modernist that sort of enriches the field instead of like reducing it to these sort of ideas of form and space. And so I think there's still some like historical, and that it's a sort of like in the way that I think Asawa is kind of like all over the place and sort of inconsistent in her work, that Calder's sort of like surprisingly childish project enriches his better known work and makes these sort of toy thing all the more charming by that sort of back and forth between these things. Where with Asawa, I get the feeling that it was like a compulsion that sometimes she should have thought about. Well, like, in the sense of like me judging what her work looks like in an exhibition, that you can tell that maybe she kind of like drifted into a direction that, some more self-consciousness would have made the show flow better or something.
Do you have any answer?
Nope.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
From the question, I wanted to share some sensorial analogy. So when you're talking about Jackson Pollock before showing MoMA, I can't help but thinking about my recent visit of Basel, Miami, and see people for the first time with a robotic dog. I enjoy Jackson Pollock's work aesthetically and morally. I don't yet with people, but also I somehow feel like am I criticized or not radical enough to a point where how history is moving forward or be depicting. Then you talk about, or before you talk about how Susan and then Cubism, make me think about how our history is being making, not lineage, but like it's afterwards and then depicting what is useful within the whole lineage narrative that makes sense. So some have to be there to make Cubism and Picasso make sense theoretically, in theory. Which make me come to this question where as a painter or as painting history have to moving on as we're still living, how would painter will be depicting history besides those alternative history, but like a formal history that's in continuation, if it's not taste, if it's not a style, what, or is history still can be functional or still there is a way to leverage valuable points within, so it's kind of fragmented, sorry.
I think I take your meaning in the sense of, that is the danger of art history, is that it sort of can very easily become sort of a categorical development that is like a linear movement of like, well, this person did this and that made this person do this and that person did this. But I think it's, on the one hand, it's sort of like, to go back to that essay I was reading, the argument was that, the traditional history of Cubism was sort of linear in the sense of like, well, Picasso did the Demoiselles d'Avignon, and then, that influenced Braque, and then Braque did the houses that looked like boxes, and then that set off Cubism. Mm-hmm. But that the Demoiselles came about from a different trajectory, and that Braque was thinking more directly about Cézanne than he had seen Picasso's work and was influenced by Picasso, but that, that there was a sort of something in the air that these people were arriving at these sorts of concerns from different standpoints. And my point is more that there's a difference between, I think a way to put it would be that like there's always something to be learned from Cézanne. You can always go back and learn something about painting, but that doesn't mean you should copy Cézanne, which is, I think, something people often try to simplify. They're like, oh, well, he did good painting, so I should copy his palette, I should copy the approach, and if I'm imitating him well enough, then I'll be also great, and that's an imitation. But that there's a difference between sort of the signifiers of someone's artwork and looking at what it is and how they did something and taking a lesson that you can apply naturally to your own process. And that I think is sort of the participation within the history of art is sort of involving yourself with these things without necessarily reducing yourself to like a direct affiliation with these things. And I think that the illusion that history is a clear line makes people confused about sort of, whatever, like people are like, oh, well, Hippenberger and Kreber were such great painters, so I'm just going to be bad guys like them or whatever. Like, I'm going to be a bad boy, and that's what good art is. And it's more like, that's not the lesson, because then you're just copying someone. The lesson is that the artist's way of being in the world somehow relates to the way they paint, and that you have to include those things in your sort of mental repertoire of what painting is about. I don't know if I'm
Yeah,
talking
actually,
myself in
you know,
circles.
no. I would add one thing to that. I know, so I was thinking, I've been thinking about this recently, and it's not a full-formed thing, and it's not about art. But we have a problem, I think, with our model of causation in general. And I think that we have this old model, you know, where X causes Y, you know, and then we get that instead of the linear story. And I don't think that's at all how causation works, right? I think a lot of things are what they call autocatalytic, you know, where A causes B, B causes A, right? There's many more complicated relationships of causation out there than what we, you know, formalize it in our head. So I think probably we have that oversimplified notion of causation in that time thing of art history, you know, which is probably one thing that's like bungled us up with postmodernism, you know, because we've got dome, 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 dome. Now what comes next, right? And probably we need to have a better model of causation. Anyway, maybe that's too esoteric. Let me finish.
Please.
I want to thank everybody for coming. I hope you got something out of the conversation. We are, both today and tomorrow, I'm the philosopher. Usually there's other philosophers that do it, but I'm doing it. I decided to do it today and tomorrow. So we do one-to-one conversations that then go onto the podcast. And so if there are things that you want to say, right, this is kind of more of a listening process, right? The philosopher kind of listens to the other person and then sort of works through it. And if you would like to do that, I'm here for another 2 hours, and we're going to open up the tent, as it were, and have conversations. And if you would like to do that. The second thing is a free gift awaits you near the front door. There's some old little philosophy books that are there, and you guys could take one. There's a hat. Instead of passing the hat, we put the talkPOPc hat there. If you feel like putting any donations in for talkPOPc, we would love to have it. We are trying to develop donations for our prison project, since we've been doing stuff in the local federal prison. But so any donations are more than welcome. There's also an online portal. And last but not least, on the online portal, there are artworks that have been donated to, that we've donated to talkPOPc, that the nonprofit itself owns, and that if you give a tax deduction, then you get a free artwork. And so it's a way to give to charity, promote some good in the world, and get an artwork at the same time. So thank you very much, everybody. We appreciate it.